Commodore 64 Music.
Some good music can be played by the Commodore 64. It has a built-in chip which is called a Sound Interface Device, the SID. I think Commodore planned to call it the Sound Interface Chip until they thought of how it abbreviated. Then they decided on Sound Interface Device. Now it does a lot of good things, and you've heard some of the sound effects in music played during the games. I'd like to show you how some of that happens. We won't talk about the special sound effects. Those can be done by any old chip. I'd like to talk about music. That's where some of the quality of the SID chip really comes out. The first thing that we should talk about in music to understand waveforms, to understand how it works, is waveforms. That's the basic sound that any instrument produces. It might be mellow, it might be sharp, it might be thin, it might be brassy, but every instrument has a certain waveform. Now, I've set up the computer so that it will play the next few notes rather like an organ. That is, when I hold down a key, it will play the note. When I let go, it will stop immediately. And so what we're going to do is concentrate on the waveforms we can hear. The first waveform I have here is a triangular waveform. That's soft and mellow. It's the sort of sound you might hear from a flute. Let's listen to the triangular waveform and hear its mellow sound. Pretty good, pretty soft, right? Not all instruments sound that mellow, however. Sometimes we want a little edge on them. Sometimes we'd like to have a bit more harmonics, as musicians call it. In that case, we might choose another waveform called a sawtooth waveform. Now, a sawtooth waveform, as you might suggest from the name, has a bit of an edge on the sound. It's much sharper, and in some ways, it's much richer. Let's listen to a sawtooth. Sounds quite different, doesn't it? And yet that really isn't the whole combination of waveforms that we can use for instruments. There are several others in there too. Sometimes instruments have a rather thin and perhaps reedy sound to them. That's called a pulse waveform. There's more than one kind of pulse waveform. I'll play the thin one first. We'll call that a pulse wave, and you'll hear what it sounds like. It's a little thin, it's a little sharp. Listen. Okay, no mistaking that, and yet sometimes we want it. Finally, the last kind of pulse wave is a particular type called a square wave. That sounds rather rich, a bit brassy. It sounds a little bit like the sawtooth, but not quite the same. Let's listen to a square wave waveform. Okay, that's pretty good stuff. Now, we've listened to the basic waveform, except for noise, which is used for drums and gunshots and things like that. But now let's talk about something else. Apart from the basic kind of thing that the instrument sounds like, its basic waveform, there are other things that give the instrument its characteristic sound. And that's how quickly the sound starts and how the sound stops. We use the terms ADSR, which stands for Attack, Decay, Sustain, Release, to describe how the sound starts, holds, and stops when an instrument is played. In fact, we call this the waveform's envelope, but we don't have to use this term. If we know what attack, decay, sustain, release is, we'll be okay. Let's talk about those. Attack is how quickly the sound appears. If you have a percussion instrument, something that you hit or strike or pluck, the sound will start right away. Then we have decay. That's how quickly the sound fades out after it's first struck or begun. Some instruments don't hold a sound for more than a moment. Some hold it for quite a while before it settles down. For example, if you hit a piano key, you may notice that at the moment that you strike that piano key, it's a little louder than the sound that settles down a moment later. That's the decay part. Now some instruments will sustain and some won't. Here's what we mean by sustain. On a piano, if you hold the key down, the note continues to sound. But on a guitar, or say a bass guitar, after you strike it, the sound will fade away. There's nothing you can do. Same thing is true, say, of a xylophone. Once you hit that note, it has to fade away. The only thing you can do is hit it again. And so we can't sustain some instruments, but others we can. For example, If we want to, we can hold down a piano key, and the sound will sustain. If we want to, we can continue to blow into a trumpet or a mouth organ, and the sound will keep going as long as we don't run out of breath. And so these instruments have sustain levels, and we can state how long they will stay in there. And finally, we have release. And that's how long it takes the sound to go away after you let go of the key. You may have noticed that when you let go of a piano key, it still sounds for a moment afterwards. When you stop blowing into a trumpet, there's usually a little bit of sound left over. Let's use some of those principles on the waveforms we've already listened to and make certain kinds of instruments. For example, our first waveform is chime-like. We'll use a soft, mellow, triangular wave, and we'll make it start immediately. When you hit a chime, it starts to sound right away. But then we'll give the sound a long time to die away. We'll give it a long decay and release. Here we go. Listen to the mellow chimes. Okay? Recognize that mellow triangular wave in there? And yet, we've changed it completely by adding an attack and a fadeaway cycle to the whole thing. Now, sometimes we want to do exactly the same kind of envelope, attack very quickly and fade away rather slowly, but we don't want that mellow waveform. If we struck a guitar, the waveform would be much sharper. A guitar has a sharper sound. Let's take the sawtooth wave, the one with an edge, and let's play that through exactly the same attack, sustain, decay, release envelope and see what we have. Here's a guitar. Listen to the difference. Now that sounds pretty good. Perhaps sometimes on some struck instrument we don't want to hold it quite as long as we've shown here. For example, a banjo. The sound doesn't hold as it does in a guitar. It fades away rather quickly. And so perhaps we could once again change to the rather thinner sound that a banjo would give us, and say, and let's have a fairly fast release, a fairly fast decay on this one. Let's listen to how the sound would change. We're going to the pulse waveform and listening to a fairly fast attack and a fairly fast decay and release. Here we go. Once again, it's different. The envelope makes quite a difference. Finally, all of the things we've talked about so far have been fast attack, instruments that we strike, percussive things, things that start to sound right away. Other instruments take time for the sound to build up. For example, a trumpet, a mouth organ, or even when we're bowing a violin, it takes time for the vibrations to reach full strength. On those, we want a slower attack and perhaps a medium sort of sustain to hold the level as long as we want to. Let's listen to the difference. I've set up a square wave for the bold, brassy sound of a trumpet, and I've set a moderately slow attack. Listen to how the sound comes in, and a moderately fast decay. Listen to it fade away. Here's a trumpet. Do you hear the difference? That's the way that we can put forth the basic waveform, which gives us our music quality, soft or rich or mellow, together with our envelope, which tells us how quickly the sound appears and disappears, to give ourselves a real musical thing. Now, we've been playing three notes, but we've been playing them all with the same instrumentation. Let's play a little tune here. Okay, let's play a little tune here which uses three different instruments. A bell-like or chime-like instrument to carry the melody, something sounding more like a mouth organ to carry the second piece, and down on the bass there's probably a big bass guitar or something that sounds like that. Let's listen to a little music here. I've been asked by the television taping staff not to dance along with the music, so I think I'll have to sit this one out.